Hey, and welcome to week 9, Student Diversity. Our guide to this week is that we have kind of a lot of readings on the table, but not all of them are required. This is really important to just be clear about what I expect you to read and what's optional for you. So there are 2 chapters that we're covering this week in your book. Chapter 6 is Science Education for Students with Diverse Perspective, and that is optional. I'll be really clear in this recording kind of what would make you say that you need to read that it isn't optional for you. And, you know, one of the reasons I've made that one optional is because a lot of what they're covering you should have learned in other coursework. And then Chapter 7, Science Education for Students with Learning Differences. Again, that's optional. Mostly that one's optional because I'm providing you with some other required readings that cover the same types of material. I will say that in Chapter 7, for each of the types of learning differences, they have a table or a chart or a list of instructional things that you might do, considerations that you might make, and those lists are fantastic. I highly recommend those. However, given my choice, I would rather assign the other materials that I'm assigning and uploading into D2L for required readings. So I'm asking that you read the NGSS Appendix D, Diversity and Equity. In writing the Next Generation Science Standards, they pulled together a really fantastic team and asked them to specifically address diversity and equity for science instruction. They did that. They've written the Appendix D, which kind of gives a broad brush stroke on each of these kind of 7 categories that they are identifying as important. And then they wrote a case study for each of those diversity or student groups. So I'm asking that you read at least 3 case studies. You are welcome to choose to read more than 3, but I'd ask that you read at least 3. And as you read them, you might want to consider both the grade level they're written for and the groups that they're written for. So you may feel like, you are focused on teaching early childhood or early elementary grades, and the student group you're most interested in is written for middle school or high school. You may still choose to read that because you're going to see examples of what it looks like to apply the principles to students that are like that. The other thing is that each of them kind of has like an introduction or preamble that explains some of the key things that would happen in a classroom in order to support that type of students. And so you may choose to just read the preamble of some of the extra ones and only read 3 case studies themselves. The other thing I'm asking you to read is some of the Office of Public Instruction, Indian Education for All materials. In Montana, when we talk about diversity and we talk about equity, our American Indian population is a huge part of that. And so I'll talk about those. And I forgot to put it on here. The essential understandings in Article 10 of the Constitution are required. The framework is just optional reading. And I do encourage you to glance through it, kind of be aware of what's in there. There's a very short video for you to watch this week, and you have 2 activities. One has to do with multiple intelligences, and the other has to do with universal design for learning. So let's get started. What do we mean by student diversity? I could kind of break down today's topic into 2 parts. One part is about learning styles, kind of generic differences in learning styles. And in this section, we're going to talk about learning modalities, multiple intelligences, and mindsets. And I call these generic differences in learning styles because they occur in all populations. You might find them in different proportions in different populations of students, but they're going to be there no matter what type of student you're talking about. And so, in fact, I think it gives us a good framework for meeting the needs of diverse individuals in our classroom if we're already attending to the general idea of learning styles. So much of what we say in terms of supporting, different ethnicities or supporting low-income students, any of those things, we can actually go back to the same techniques that we would do to support different learning styles. The second part is diversity and its implications for learning. So within that, we're going to talk about economically disadvantaged students, race, ethnicity, and cultural differences in students. We'll talk about disabilities, English language learners, gender, and the gifted and talented students. And so you can see what I mean by that second part being more about student populations or student groups, and the top part being learning styles or things that we would see within a group of students with disabilities. We would still see all different learning modalities. We'd relates to all different types of intelligence and all different mindsets. And so we're going to really think of those things a little bit separately. And we could say in your book, the first one is one chapter and the second one is another chapter. But as both chapters in your book are optional reading this week, I want to kind of give a broader brushstroke to why these two things are being included. So the first thing, this idea of learning modalities, and on some level, with learning modalities, we're talking about visual, auditory, and tactile or kinesthetic learning. And on some level, the issue of learning modalities is one of comfort level. Sometimes when there's a disability, it goes beyond comfort level, and there's a student who truly isn't even able to use one of those modalities. For example, a deaf student really can't use the modality of auditory learning. A blind student can't use visual learning. But for a student without any severe disabilities, we all use all three types. So what we really then are talking about is we have a preference for how we take information, and we have a strength, a way in which we're strongest. Personally, I'm a visual learner. I'm a tactile person. I love to do things with my hands. I love to listen to music, pretty in tune with the auditory environment around me. In fact, in my office, they make fun of me that I cannot refrain from turning around and looking when somebody walks by the door because I'm just really sensitive to sounds. But when it comes to learning, how I learn, it's visual. I have to work a lot harder to learn things through the other two modalities. And as your book points out, our modality can change, and it will change during our lifetime. Young children tend to be stronger in a tactile or kinesthetic modality and develop into auditory and visual learners later. So we should always work hard to include all three modalities every single day in our classroom. And this is so important because this is not just about it's not about, we'll talk about multiple intelligences. It's not about kind of a bigger, broader idea about how we learn. It's actually about how we take information in and whether we're going to be able to take the information in a meaningful way. And so because these can be so strong, we really need to work hard to always be addressing all three of these. And when we're working with elementary children, we should really focus on making sure we provide opportunities for kinesthetic learners or tactile learners. I had listed this section of your book as optional, but that's because I assume you've learned about these three modalities in other courses. If you haven't, take some time to look over this section and try out the activities. They have some great suggestions for like what it looks like to include visual, what it looks like to include auditory, and what it looks like to include kinesthetic. And so if that's not something that kind of is in the back of your mind because you've already learned it, you should take a few minutes to become familiar with that now. The next thing we're going to talk about is multiple intelligences. And I want to say, you know, I've spent a lot of time actually teaching courses about learning and courses about human abilities within that. And Gardner's multiple intelligence is actually a theory that I struggle with, partly because of the way that people implement it, and partly because of this right here. This graphic that I chose it because it's great. It lists the graphic on the outside and things on the inside then that kind of give you a better idea of that. So verbal linguistic would be about words. I'm somebody who's really good at using their words, whereas logical mathematical would be somebody who is very, very logical, probably pretty linear, and good with equations. Okay, but I really have a hard time with the use of the word smart here, and it's just kind of part of the way that this theory is built. It uses the word intelligence right in the theory. And as you'll hear me say in the next section, when I talk about mindset, I really have a hard time with this idea of smart and what's natural and this idea that we can't change, we can't shift that, we can't decide to work hard at things and struggle through those things and get to a point where we actually have different strengths than we might have in the past. And so at the same time, this is such a common theory, and so I can't really leave it out. And it is something that's really important to address because regardless of whether I can help a student to feel more comfortable with logical mathematical activities, or whether I can help somebody feel more comfortable with musical activities, they're going to come into my classroom with kind of an array of things that are natural for them, things that they're either natural because they've had previous experience with them, or whatever it means that is coming naturally to them. But we all do have things within this that that come more quickly, more easily to us. I'm not requiring you to read the section on multiple intelligences. However, if you are not familiar with it, you might want to take some time to look at the book. There are a couple of really key things that I want to say about this theory. And as I already said, sometimes I really struggle with the way that this is misused. So one thing that's important is that, often I've heard people say, we really should include all of these in our classroom. Well, that's true, but even Gardner would say we shouldn't include all of these in our classroom every day. And I said with the last one, with the auditory, visual, and tactile, we should definitely be including those every day. With these, we should be including them across the broader spectrum of our classroom, but that doesn't mean that we should try to fit each of these into every lesson. That becomes not just unmanageable, but not helpful to our students. And as an example, I would say that when I taught in a classroom, most of my experience is teaching high school physics. So you can imagine that in a high school physics classroom, logical mathematical abilities are pretty huge. There's definitely a huge focus on that. We also have a big focus in a high school physics classroom on visual spatial. We need to be able to understand and represent and see things in relation to each other. And there's a heavy, I guess in high school science in general, there's pretty heavy verbal linguistic. I need to be able to read things to understand them. I need to be comfortable with my text. Those three things came up every single day in my classroom. And definitely we also every day had some bodily kinesthetic because we included hands-on activities. But the rest of these didn't necessarily come up every day. However, across the entire year, I always included a major project, and major for me meant worth a test grade, that played to the strengths of students who really excelled in these other areas. So for example, if I just use musical intelligence as a sample of that. Twice during the year, students were encouraged to take advantage of their musical intelligences or their musical abilities. And they, in one case, for the review for one of our unit tests, every lab group had to write a song and perform it for the class. Now, they could perform it on video. They could have somebody else sing it. They had to be involved somehow. And they would get up and they would perform that. So that not only was helping the student who is really in tune to music to have a stronger review for that test, but also the student for whom that is really their ability, something they love to do, they're able to get into and be engaged in an activity that they otherwise might not have been. The other one that I did was when we did our unit on sound, lab groups each had to form a band. They had to have a woodwind instrument, a string instrument, a percussion instrument, and then if they had a fourth person, they could have two of one of those. And then, or I guess the woodwind, it could have been wood or brass. It had to be something that used air moving through it. They had to play a song. It had to be recognizable. Well, that had some strong implications for the topic that we were studying of sound, and how you make different pitches and frequencies and amplitudes of sound, but it also then allowed those students who really identified with music to get into the activity. So one of your activities for this week is going to be to go to a website and kind of find out what your strengths are. So you may look at this and say, I know what my strengths are. I look at this and I say, I know that my strengths, I have a logical mathematical strength, I have a visual spatial strength, but if I had to kind of go down the list and start saying what are my strongest weaknesses, I don't know. I don't know exactly how I would pick those out, how I would say which of those things are the hardest for me, not because I don't know things are hard for me, but because in relation to each other, sometimes there's things that I just avoid doing. I'm not actually sure which ones are hardest because I avoid them. And so I'm going to ask you to go online and take the kind of survey, and in your forum post, you're going to comment on which are your strengths and which are your weaknesses, and what implications that is for the classroom. So for example, my weaknesses when I took this, one of my weaknesses is actually bodily kinesthetic. I am the clumsiest person you have ever met. I it's really lucky I have strong bones. Uh, Otherwise, I'd be broken all the time. And I don't seek out opportunities to excel in that way because I'm frankly a little bit afraid that I'll get hurt. Um, and it's interesting that I probably wouldn't have picked that out as my weakest thing when I was just kind of looking. I might have picked a different one as my weakest, but that is what came out in the survey as my weakest. And then when I really got thinking about in my classroom what types of activities I included, I just kind of included hands-on activities, but not the idea that students would be learning through a representation with their body other than just doing something hands-on, which is really more tactile than bodily kinesthetic. In D2L, I'm just uploading an additional graphic, and it's a great graphic, I think, especially for elementary teachers. And it lists love and need for each intelligence. And so for somebody who really excels in logical mathematical, the things they love are, and the things that they really need are. And so I felt like this is something that might help you as you think through that question that you'll answer on the forum about what you need to focus on including in your classroom. You may think about looking at the list of needs for the intelligence that you were weakest on, and think about how to include things in your classroom that would meet those needs if they aren't things that come naturally to you. I also want to point out that the graphic that I'm including is missing naturalistic. Naturalistic was added later. There were originally 7 intelligences, and your book and the graphics that I'm presenting have 8. Sometimes you'll see a graphic that has 9, which the 9th one is existential, but even Gardner himself doesn't consider this a full-blown intelligence, and sometimes you'll see things where he says there are 8.5 intelligences. The existential is a half of an intelligence, and so I've left it out here, but I just don't want you to be confused if you ever come across that and see that. Mostly it's that kind of as time has gone on, people have identified other ways that we can relate to the world and other ways that we can have kind of sets of ability. The third thing that I want to talk about in this first section is mindset. And your book actually refers to this as locus of control, whether you have an internal or an external locus of control. And I don't really want to say that the idea of locus of control is out of date. It's still a very relevant way to think of things. But I'll talk a little bit more after I talk about mindset, about how it's different than mindset and maybe why I prefer mindset as a way to think about this. So Carol Dweck came up with this idea of the fixed and growth mindset. She's been very popular in recent years. In fact, if you're working in schools in Montana and in other states as well, but especially in Montana, you'll find that many of our districts have a strong focus on Carol Dweck's work with mindset. And so becoming familiar with that is really helpful as you prepare to go into school buildings. In her work, she differentiates between the idea of a fixed and a growth mindset. You'll watch a video of this. The video that I'm giving you to watch is a short version of it. It's not completely geared towards education. She talks about education and then talks about implications for other things. There are lots of videos out there. If you're interested in this and you have some spare time, you can watch like a 20-minute version or a 40-minute version of Carol's kind of talk that she gives around the world about mindset. Within this theory, the idea of a fixed mindset refers to individuals who believe their success is based on their innate ability. Some people are just better at things than others. Okay, so a great example of this is we often hear people talk about being not good at math or not good at science. Maybe I'm not good at reading. I would like to say that the fixed mindset should be a historical item at this point. In terms of our understanding of the brain and our understanding of learning, we've moved way beyond the idea that intelligence is stable and inherited. We understand learning a lot more beyond that. And in the research community, that's probably true, that we've kind of moved beyond the idea of the fixed mindset or the fixed intelligence as a reality. But in the world, we still hear these ideas that intelligence is fixed. all the time. And I think about the number of students who get to upper elementary or middle school and they're in their math class and they come home with homework and they're frustrated and they want help and they turn to their parents and they ask for help and they hear the words, "I was never good at math. Math just isn't my thing." I'm not saying it happens in every home, but it happens a lot. In fact, I see it all the time on Facebook with my peers who have kids the same age as my children who are saying, "I feel so overwhelmed. I've gotten to the point where math is beyond me and I just can't even learn and understand what they're doing." This idea of that intelligence is static, that I'm either good at math or I'm not, is really uh, what we see in Carol Dweck's research and other people who are researching this is that that's really damaging, and it's not true. That intelligence isn't fixed; it can be developed. Our strengths can change over time, which kind of guides us to the growth mindset. In the growth mindset, people with a growth mindset believe that success is based on their hard work, the active learning that they do, their training, and their perseverance. The other day we had a great example of this at my house. My younger child, Nicholas, is in third grade. He has an amazing teacher who actively teaches our students to have a growth mindset. My older child, Jonathan, is currently in sixth grade, and he's a really hard worker, but I would say that sometimes he definitely suffers from a fixed mindset. He has a definite list in his mind of things he's good at, things he's not good at, and he kind of sticks within that world. And it's always a struggle to push him to try harder at things that he just wants to give up on. Jonathan came home and asked me to help him to study for an earth science test. He had a worksheet where he had to cut apart different pieces of paper and match them back up so he had the correct name, description, drawing, etc. for the different things that happen at plate boundaries. So like mountains and volcanoes and like the trench and the ocean and all of these things. And he had glued one of the sections together incorrectly. He had the rift and the trench in the ocean. He had the way that they're formed backwards. And one of them is formed by a convergent plate and one is formed by a divergent plate. And so here he is, I'm quizzing him and he's telling me the right thing. He's saying that the rift is divergent and the trench is convergent, but that's not what he has glued down. So we have this whole conversation about how he ended up with the wrong thing in his book. And he says out loud, oops, sorry. And he says out loud, I am, to his dad, he says, "I'm so glad that I'm studying with mom because I had it wrong and mom helped me find out that I was wrong." And those were exact words. He said, "I was wrong." And his little brother heard him. And now remember that he's in sixth grade, his brother's in third. His little brother says, "No, Jonathan, you didn't get it wrong. Mom just helped you learn something and your brain grew a little bit." To which his older brother, of course, rolled his eyes, but it was a great example of this growth mindset. A mistake is an opportunity to grow. If I work hard, I can change the outcome. Every time I see that I'm wrong, I can see that as an opportunity for my brain to grow, for myself to improve. So this graphic that you can see here, you see that a fixed mindset, intelligence is static, and I want to really focus on some of these kind of key things that you can think about as you try to identify fixed and growth mindsets. So it leads to a desire to look smart. Okay, someone with a fixed mindset wants to appear that they know. And when it comes to challenges, they'll tend to avoid a challenge because, and I apologize for the typos. I took this off the internet. I didn't make this. They'll tend to avoid the challenges because if I engage in a challenge and I fail, people will know that I failed. They'll see that I'm not smart. When they encounter an obstacle, they will either get defensive or give up. They're not going to push against the obstacle to kind of make way or move forward. As far as effort, they'll see effort as fruitless. Sometimes it's even worse. It's hurting them to make an effort at something. Criticism, they'll ignore useful negative feedback. And so when somebody says, "I really liked what you did here, but here's another thing you could consider," it's kind of like they shut down to that piece because that's something that's identifying somebody else seeing them as not smart or not successful, and they tend to feel threatened by the success of others. And what we really see with people with fixed mindsets, whether they have a fixed mindset and they're successful or they have a fixed mindset and they're not successful, we tend to see people plateau and achieve less than their full potential. So a lot of times you'll find students who things have always come really naturally to them and they've always really been smart, or labeled as smart, and they'll get to a point where they kind of stop trying because things didn't come easy to them anymore. They'll plateau and they'll kind of tank. And we see these really sad stories of students who everybody thought they had so much potential and they just never achieve that. They don't choose to go to college. They don't choose to work in a challenging career. A lot of things like that. In a growth mindset, intelligence can be developed and it leads to a desire to learn. Okay, so you're going to embrace a challenge as an opportunity. When a setback comes, you keep trying because you want to see the way through. You want to learn what you can from it. They see effort as a path to mastery. If I work hard enough, I can get this. They tend to learn from criticism. When somebody says, this is something you can do better, they really glom onto that because they believe that they can be getting better and they need to know that to get better. And they find lessons and inspiration in the success of others. And so they don't tend to be threatened by it. They'll seek out successful people to try to learn from them. And what we see with students with a growth mindset is even if they kind of appeared at first to not have as many abilities or be as successful, they tend to really develop and show higher and higher and higher. And we often say they will later in life look back and say, wow, they achieved far beyond the potential that we would have identified for them. And so it wouldn't be true to say that successful people all have growth mindsets. It would be true to say that people who really seem to be fulfilling their potential or going beyond the potential we would have identified for them probably have growth mindsets. So how does this relate to what's in your book? An external locus of control is the idea that external factors determine my success, and an internal locus of control is the idea that internal factors do. We could almost say that external is like fixed and internal is like growth, but it's not quite right because within the locus of control issue, it is acceptable within the internal locus of control to say, well, I just had a higher ability at that, and so I did better. And within the growth mindset, the idea of what our ability is just kind of our starting point that we're going to grow from, not why we succeed. So while if you want to know more about locus of control, you're welcome to read your book. I would really say that where the great things from locus of control are present in the idea of mindset, and so you would probably do better to spend your time learning more about the fixed and growth mindset. It's definitely something we hear more about in our Montana schools. So I hope that as I went through this, that you might be reflecting a little bit on where you lie on the continuum. And I think that's important for each of us as teachers to think about that for ourselves. So if I think about that for myself, I definitely have a growth mindset when it comes to academics and physical challenges. I really believe that if I don't achieve things, it's because of my own choices. It's because I didn't try. And I can usually even point and say, hey, right there, that's where I gave up and stopped trying, and that must be why I didn't achieve it. I'm not terribly competitive with other people, but I'm pretty competitive with myself. I get really frustrated if I feel like I didn't do my best, if I didn't give it my all. But for social things, I have a pretty fixed mindset. I tend to attribute my success or failure in social environments to external factors like, well, it was just really noisy, or all the people already knew each other. I couldn't, it felt awkward to like butt into the conversation. And so I tend to not have that same attitude of I need to figure out where to put my effort and how to overcome obstacles the way that I do with academic and physical challenges. And so I think it's really important for me then, as I realize that when I'm working with a student who has a fixed mindset, to try and think about what it feels like for me when I'm working in that environment where I have that fixed mindset, because that really helps me to help a student to identify what they need to do to kind of shift that mindset. And I know a lot of people who are the opposite of me. They have a really great growth mindset. They are willing to go out and take on any social challenge. But when it comes to academics, they feel like it doesn't really matter. I can find other ways around it, and I'm just not good at it anyway. And so, I think it's important for us to, as teachers, to think about that and reflect on that for ourselves, because recognizing the mindsets in our students and working to help them realize that they can change is a huge key to success and a huge kind of lifelong thing that we can teach them. So now we're going to move on to And I know this week's recording is just really long. I apologize for that. There's just a lot of stuff here. Now we're going to move on to the kind of groups of students and the things that we can be doing in the classroom for these groups of students. And for every group of students, being able to meet the needs of their learning styles or to meet the needs of helping them to have that growth mindset is going to help. But within different groups of students, there are other things beyond that that we can talk about specifically. And before we talk about any specific group of students, I want to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I hope that you've been exposed to this before. When I think about supporting diverse groups and diverse student groups in our classrooms, I really think it's important to understand this hierarchy. So we can break the basic human, or we can break the hierarchy down into basic human needs, physiological needs, and safety needs are basic human needs. And then psychological needs, self-esteem, belongingness, and love, those are psychological needs. And then self-fulfillment needs, this idea of achieving our full potential and including creative activities. So what Maslow's hierarchy says is that I have to meet these before I can even worry about these. And I have to meet these before I can even worry about these. And I'm never going to get here unless I've actually kind of traveled up this ladder. Unless I've kind of traveled up this ladder and I've gotten to this point of being able to really meet all of those other needs along the way. So let's think about some of the groups that we're going to talk about. And actually, I want to say sometimes I think that it's more important to think about meeting basic needs before psychological than worrying about physiological before safety. I think that our experience as humans really depends. There are some people who've had really extreme experiences with safety where feeling secure is actually more important than eating food. And there are other people, you know, for whom it being hungry is really a bigger deal than being safe. And so I would just say that we want to make sure that we're aware of the three groupings, maybe more than within them, the order. So if we think about a diverse group, so let's think about the economically disadvantaged child, a child who lives in poverty and comes to school, you know, not having gotten enough water and feeling kind of dehydrated and not having enough food and feeling pretty hungry. And we're going to try to teach them without addressing those needs, we're really not going to get very far. It's pretty hard to sit and pay attention and engage in a lesson when physically you're struggling. Or, you know, a student who comes to school and doesn't feel safe in the school building. Maybe there's another individual there. Maybe there's something else going on in the building that makes them feel unsafe. If I can't meet those needs, I'm not going to be able to teach them. And so as we talk about these different student groups, I want you to kind of be aware as we look at the recommendations, you know, when are we looking at recommendations that are just about basic needs? Another group that we'll talk about is gender, and we'll talk specifically about females. And so if a female student who's never seen a female succeed in math and science and has been told perhaps by her community that she shouldn't consider going into math and science, that's not what girls do. So now when that girl is struggling in our science class, it's probably a good idea to stop and address that issue of belonging, that issue of esteem that's cropping up. And, you know, we didn't create the issue, but we're going to need to address that issue. Otherwise, that student will never be successful in engaging in our class. Okay, so let's talk about each of the different groups that we need to be aware of. So the first group, economically disadvantaged students. Just a couple of facts. 14.8% of Montanans were below the poverty level in the 2008 to 2012 census. In 2012, 19% of Montanans aged 5 to 17 were in a family in poverty. That means 1 in 5 students in our state is coming to school, not just eligible for free and reduced lunch, but actually living below the federal poverty level. 1 in 5 students. 40.8% of students are eligible for free and reduced lunch in the 2010-2011 school year. So that means almost half of our students in Montana are coming from families where, based on just economic factors, it might be difficult to have healthy food at home. And unless they're coming in and taking advantage of that free and reduced lunch, they may be struggling with hunger issues. So some key strategies to support economically disadvantaged students. One is connect science education to their sense of place as a physical, historical, and sociocultural thing. So if I'm economically disadvantaged, there's a good chance, even if I'm having those basic needs met, that from a psychological perspective, I may have some issues with belonging, especially in a world where television and media are so huge. I may feel like where I come from isn't good enough, and that might make it really hard for me to engage in school. And so connecting to my sense of place, my sense, the physical place where I live, the historical aspects of the place where I live, the sociocultural dimensions of the place where I live will help me to engage in school in a meaningful way. And I think about in Butte, Montana, where there's there was a huge boom, there was a mine, and people, at one point it was one of the wealthiest towns in the world, and now we have a lot of families who are there, and the mine isn't open, and there's been a real change in the um, economic structure of the town. But there are great programs that take the students from those classrooms and they take them out into their community and teach them science in their community. They take them to the pit. They take them to the rivers nearby. They take them to these places that are actually kind of forming the foundation of a new economy in their community as they clean up from the mine that was there. The next one is to apply students' funds of knowledge and cultural practices. The more that we can help students to identify what they do know and share that with us and share that back with them and use that as part of our instruction, the more they'll feel a sense of belonging in our classroom and be able to engage in our instruction. Use project-based science learning as a form of connected science. Allow those students to get their hands in there and to really engage in what they're doing and not just talk to economically disadvantaged students, especially. That becomes important. And then provide school resources and funding for science instruction. And I want to say something specific here. It doesn't really address the idea of technology specifically, but the idea of providing school resources. It's really important if we're going to ask students to do anything that requires technology outside of the classroom, that we're ensuring that every student has a pathway to that technology. I was thinking the other day, and I'll use my own children as an example. We have computers in our home, and that's fine. And my 6th grader and I were talking about how many assignments he's having to do this year that require the use of a computer. There's a child, we live up in the mountains, quite literally up in the mountains, 3 miles outside of Helena, up a dirt road. And there's another child who lives nearby us up in the mountains who doesn't have good internet. It's really hard to have good internet in the mountains. It's expensive, and his family has decided that it's not worth the expense of trying to have that internet. It's just too slow to be worth it. But there's not a bus that brings that child back into town. And so if that child isn't given the space within the school day to upload something onto Google Docs or to do that web search that he's supposed to do, once he gets home, he's too far from the library to walk and use the library, and he's too far from the school to walk and use the school. So it's really important every time that you're thinking of asking students and allowing students to use technological resources or things that they would need to get out of a library, that you're thinking about the economically disadvantaged student who may not have that in their home and may not have a pathway to get back to the school or to get to a library to take care of that. The next thing we're going to talk about is race and ethnicity, and this is kind of going to be an expanded conversation. We're going to add, the reading that I've asked you to do focuses kind of just on race and ethnicity, and we're going to add culture into this conversation to address something very specific to Montana, and that is the Montana American Indians. So in Montana, we have 87% white population. 0.6, so like just basically 0.5% of people who are Black or African American, and they identify that as their only race. We have 6.5% American Indian or Alaska Native. We have 0.8% Asian, 0.1% Native and other Pacific Islander, and so that Native is talking about the the tribes in the Pacific Islands, not American Indian tribes. 2.5% that are two or more races. And so those two or more races could be a combination of Black and Hispanic, a combination of American Indian and Asian, however those combinations might be, but those are people who report two or more. And then 3.3% Hispanic or Latino. So you can see um, in our world, here in Montana, we are primarily and predominantly white. A lot of the resources out there to address race and ethnicity therefore become less than relevant to our conversations about instruction because we don't have the huge populations of non-white people. Our largest non-white population is our American Indians, which we do have a lot of information to support. The four things that come out of the appendix that I've asked you to read are that when we're working with racial and ethnic groups, we should definitely use culturally relevant pedagogy. We need to make sure that we're using instruction that ties directly to their culture, their belief system, their understanding of the world. And, we really, whatever community we're teaching in, we need to go out of our way to understand what culturally relevant pedagogy would be. We want to make sure that we're involved in the community and we're teaching our children to be involved in the community, or teaching our students to be involved in the community and to have some social activism. One of the greatest things that we can do to get students engaged in their own learning is to find relevant things that they can become active about, they can care about. And what that looks like varies a lot in different communities, but it's been very successful with different racial, ethnic, and cultural groups. We want to make sure we're always providing multiple representations and multimodal experiences to really allow for all the variations in what an individual's culture might present, especially when we think about the Native American people and the storytelling that happens. And the amount of oral history that exists, we want to make sure that if a child has been raised where that's the primary form of transfer of knowledge for them, and we bring them into a classroom where we're only transferring knowledge visually, we're probably going to have some struggles. And so having multiple representations, having multimodal experiences for students is important. And then this is huge, having support systems that have role models and mentors of similar racial or ethnic backgrounds, especially in Montana when we think about reservation schools that some of our reservation schools have a lot of Native American instructors in them. There are other reservation schools that have primarily white instructors. And so really going out of our way to have school support systems that have role models and mentors that are similar to our students is very powerful. So let's talk about ways in which Montana is unique. So there are two things about Montana that I would identify as being unique. One is our Montana American Indians, and the other are our rural communities. So the resources that we have to support teachers for our Montana American Indians, we have Article 10 of the Montana Constitution, which you'll be reading as one of your required readings. We have the Essential Understandings, which address the Montana Constitution and make very clear exactly what should be done in our classrooms. And we have the framework, which is a guide for teachers and administrators for implementing Indian education for all. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those things, but that's kind of one of the big things that's unique to Montana. But I want to also, before I get into the details about Indian education for all, I want to say that another thing unique to Montana is our rural communities. We have more cows per square mile than people. We also have more elk than we have more deer. I mean, the amount of things that live on the land or in the wild other than people that inhabit our space is pretty huge. 40% of our schools have less than 50 students in them, and 55% have less than 100. Think about that. When I was teaching high school physics, I had 160 students, just me. So now think about a school building that only has 100 students in it. What does the staff look like? What does the community look like? How far are those kids traveling? Down in Beaverhead County, where we have Lima and we have Dillon, there are students who travel 100 miles one way to school. That's a huge thing to think about, the implications for those communities and those cultural values of those communities that are we really need to be aware of who those students are and what it would mean to have culturally relevant instruction for our rural communities as well. We have more one-room schoolhouses in Montana than the rest of the U.S. combined. I believe that we have this year 65 operating one-room schoolhouses, which means that there is literally one room that either covers K through 8, and then students might travel to another city for 9-12, or actually covers K through 12. And on the subject of that K-8 and 9-12, the legal dropout age in Montana is still completion of 8th grade or turning 16, whichever comes second. Legally, our dropout age doesn't require students to complete high school. And that is in large part due to our rural communities. And agriculture is one of our largest industries, which means that children of farmers and ranchers are a very large section of our school populations, especially in those 40 or 55% of schools that have very low populations, where students are traveling a long way. Being aware, especially for those of us that didn't grow up on a farm, didn't grow up on a ranch, being aware of the culture of farmers and ranchers can be very, very important. And so I think that that's something that some of you may have had experience with as you grew up, but for those that didn't, that's something that it'd be important to kind of take some time to understand, and especially to think about the implications that that has for science instruction. Drawing on a student's fund of knowledge from home to teach biology when you have a child who has grown up on a farm or a ranch is huge. They know so many things that the rest of the population doesn't know because they have literally been helping to birth animals or to sow seeds or to harvest the land since they were very young. So that's my soapbox about rural communities and how important it is for us as educators to be aware of the implications of having such a strong and large rural community. So let's talk about Montana American Indians. Indian education for all is actually a part of our Constitution. In Article 10, the state recognizes the distinct and unique cultural heritage of the American Indians and is committed to its educational goals to the preservation of their cultural integrity. And in then the statement about Article 10, Section 1, 2 of the Constitution, we state there are two things stated that are really important. One is that every Montanan, whether Indian or non-Indian, will be encouraged to learn about the distinct and unique heritage of American Indians in a culturally responsive manner. And then two, that every educational agency and all educational personnel will work cooperatively with the tribes or those tribes that are in close proximity when providing instruction or when implementing an educational goal or adopting a rule relating to the education of each Montana citizen, to include information specific to the cultural heritage and contemporary contributions of American Indians, with particular emphasis on Montana Indian tribal groups and government. So that's our law, that's our Constitution. Our Constitution says we have to do this. So not only is it just great practice to have place-based and culturally relevant education, but we've actually included it in our Constitution. So in order to support this, in 2010 we published the Essential Understandings Regarding Montana Indians, and in 2012 it was revised. This is your required reading for the week. You're going to need to read this and to really reflect on what does it mean to make sure that I'm including information about the 7 unique tribes or the 7 unique reservations in our state. What does it mean to include these essential understandings in our instruction? The other thing that I've given, this one is an optional reading, is the framework. Usually when I refer to the framework, I'm talking about the one for science, but we also have the framework for Indian Education for All, and it's a framework to support implementation. And like I said, this is optional reading for you this week, but this is one of my favorite graphics from the framework. And it really shows us this idea that we need to be integrating concepts with content, with skill sets, with context. And it gives some examples here that the content in the case of this course would be science. That's the content that we need to be including. The skill sets, we've talked about the importance of reading and writing, speaking and listening. We'll talk more later about technology. Problem solving is a huge part of science, research, collaboration, critical thinking. As I teach science, I need to be incorporating all of these skill sets. The context for that is all of these different things. In science, a lot of times the context is a hands-on experience, or um, or in early grades, maybe an informational text that tells a story that relates back to my content. And the concept then that comes in are things like patterns and relationships. And we've talked already a little bit about the other framework, the one for science, with the cross-cutting concepts. The idea here being that as we work on integrating these things, in many cases, using the contributions of Native American people or American Indian people allows us to integrate into our content the skill sets, the concepts, and the context that we need to make it relevant. So again, this is just one thing out of that book that's optional reading that you might want to consider looking at. There are only two left that we're going to talk about, I believe. One is disabilities. So students with disabilities have IEPs, or individualized education plans. Of course, we will have some students in our classes who have disabilities and haven't been identified, and hopefully we all take a course on kind of the process of helping to identify a student that hasn't been identified. Everybody will take part at some point in revising an IEP or helping to identify what should be in an IEP. But for the purpose of today, we're just going to assume that we're talking about the students that have already come to our class, they're in our class, they have those IEPs, and they mandate accommodations and modifications that we have to provide. So I want to make sure we define accommodation and modification. An accommodation allows a student to overcome or work around their disabilities, but have the same performance expectations as their peers. Okay, we're not modifying their outcome. We are not giving them a different target to shoot for. We're just giving them a different pathway to get there. For modifications, they generally change the actual curriculum or performance expectations for a student. And in a modification, we're saying the student's not going to be able to, for whatever reason, get to the same outcome, the same performance expectation. And so we need to modify that because we need to give a different target or a different mastery level to that student. So every year you're going to need to address different accommodations and modifications in your classroom. And the shift from year to year will be minimal if you do two things. One, differentiate your instruction to allow multiple paths to the same achievement level. And two, use universal design for learning. And in your lesson plan that you have to write, you need to include some differentiation. And so I really encourage you to think about, what does it mean then to provide accommodations? Okay, I don't want you in your lesson plan to be trying to target modifications unless you're actually thinking of a specific class where you already know the IEPs. I want you to target accommodations. So here's an example for that. Okay, when you're thinking about differentiation and you're thinking about accommodations, I want you to think about, what do you really want for mastery? Okay, so let's say that you are having and a lot of you have this built into your lesson plans already. You really, you want your students to write about something. So what are you really testing? Are you testing their ability to write? Are you testing their ability to develop a plan and a structure and kind of plan out their writing? Are you testing their ability to articulate an idea? Or are you testing their ability to produce a specific answer? Deciding what it is that you're looking for mastery on will change what your accommodation looks like, or what your differentiation looks like. So if I say, well, ultimately, I really want to be able to assess two things. I want to assess whether they've articulated their own idea, whether they have a claims as evidence and reasoning model, like we talked about in terms of writing. I want to know, can they make a claim, say this is my evidence, and articulate their reasoning? Can they articulate that? And then the other thing, I probably want to see if they can produce a specific answer. Are they able to get to a specific claim or a specific set of claims that I'm targeting, that I see based on the experiences that I provided for them as correct? So let's say I have a student who struggles specifically with writing. They have an IEP that provides accommodations for writing. it would be completely appropriate for me to allow that student to either verbally deliver their argument or their response to me, record their response and have a computer program transcribe it. Those would be fine. I'm still getting to the same performance expectation, the same mastery level that I'm expecting their peers to get to. I'm just providing them a different pathway to get there. If I'm testing their writing ability specifically, that might not be appropriate. Okay, so we want to really, as we think about both, and we'll talk next week about assessment, but as we think about what it is that we're assessing and what the intent of our assignment is, that allows us to provide appropriate differentiation. Okay, and being able to do that is what allows us to provide that least restrictive, inclusive environment that the law requests for students with disability. Your activity this week is about universal design for learning, and my hope in assigning this activity is that it'll give you some really kind of practical examples about why this matters and the types of things that you should be considering when you think about this. So for this activity, you'll go to this link and you'll be able to pick a classroom, elementary, middle school, or high school. And when you pick that classroom, they'll give you some students that have some specific needs, and you'll have to really think through what does it mean to design to really meet the needs of each of those students. So if you are looking at K-5, you should select the elementary classroom. If you're looking at 6-8, you should select the middle school classroom. ELL students, most teachers in Montana won't have a significant ELL population in their classroom, and I just have a couple of fun did you know facts for you. One is that a large portion of our ELL students speak German. Many of those ELL students are Hutterites, and so most of our ESL students, English as a second language students, do speak German. We have a growing population of Spanish-speaking students in our state, but a lot of them, we have very large Hutterite communities where German is actually the first language for those students. The other thing is that many of our ELL students don't actually speak a second language proficiently. They don't qualify it as an ESL, or English as a second language, because they just don't have very strong language skills to begin with. They qualify as an English language learner because they need to develop proficiency in English, but they don't actually fluently speak another language either. So these strategies to support this list comes from the appendix, but I really recommend for this section, especially if you are teaching in a community or you're looking at a community where you would have ELLs in your classroom, to look at the section of the book, Instructional Strategies for ELL Students. It's a great list of really relevant things specific to science. So the ones that are listed in the appendix are to have literacy strategies for all students, and we've talked a lot about literacy, and we've talked about using reading and using writing and supporting reading and supporting writing, and so just doing that is a really positive thing for ELLs. Another is to have language support for ELLs and really specifically support that. And if you're working with a population of ELLs, it would be really good to take a course specific to supporting that. Discourse strategies, talking about what it means to have discourse. And in science, a lot of that is actually talking about the argumentation discourse, this kind of having structured ideas of what language looks like in English, and then providing some home language support and home culture connections, and especially in Montana, where many of our students designated as ELL have a very definitive culture in their home. Being aware of that and making connections back to the culture in the home is important. The next thing we're going to talk about is gender, and there's I have a full infographic that you can visit to see. I just took one section of that infographic, but I want to point out that many of the students in this class are female, and also many of the students in this class, when they did their introduction and as throughout the forum, I've seen again and again reference to this idea that science is something I've always struggled with. Science really isn't my thing, and so I would say that I would say the same thing about myself. During elementary school, I didn't really enjoy science. In high school, I took science because I felt like I was supposed to. I didn't really like it very much. I ended up teaching science kind of honestly, I ended up teaching science because I didn't want to grade student writing because I felt uncomfortable with hurting students' feelings when I had to provide negative feedback, which ultimately I would have to do. Um, and I knew that as a female, it was easier to get a job as a science teacher than an English teacher. And so I made a decision to certify to teach science instead. I'm very grateful that I did that. I've learned to love science, but I think that we definitely see some interesting factors in our country about science and women um, and and how that plays out for degrees and jobs and um, a whole lot of things. So how do we support girls in science? The reality is that girls don't underperform their male peers unless their beliefs about science and girls are getting in the way. So what do you need to do as a teacher? You know, you can see all these facts on the screen about how girls just that we're girls aren't in these jobs, girls aren't getting these degrees. So as a teacher, especially an elementary teacher, the best things that you can do is when you're picking a textbook, look for gender bias. Is there an equal representation of males and females in the images? I mean, sheer numbers. Are there as many pictures of girls as boys? And that doesn't mean look for pictures where it's like, sometimes people are worried about this gender issue, and you see books where it's like a child drawn that doesn't have gender. That's not what we want to see either. We want to see active images of both males and females doing science, and we want it to be that the representations are equal. It's not like boys are always doing one type of thing and girls are always doing another. I think that textbook companies have gotten a lot better about balancing these types of things, but that's an important thing to look for. Be aware of your own talk. Be aware of the things that you say about science and about your feelings about science. And in your own way, try to provide a positive role model of being a female who does science to the girls. Even if that's something that you question for yourself about your own kind of efficacy for science, but try to provide a role model of a female doing science. And then find role models for the girls. Get in touch with programs that are focused on supporting females in STEM or science specifically, like the Girls STEM Collaborative. They can get you hooked up with all kinds of programs that have female mentors or that focus on providing opportunities for girls to engage with science and after-school programs in ways that are attractive and meaningful to them. And our last one is gifted and talented. So this is one that I have a little bit of a soapbox on, and I know you've been listening to my voice for way too long now. So here are my really important thing. The most important thing about GT, gifted or TAG, gifted and talented students, is that they're not always high achievers and they have really unique learning needs. So learn to identify a gifted and talented student. The number of students who came to me as a high school teacher who were underperforming and miserable and hated school, who had just never been identified as a GT student and should have been, was huge. And when we fail to identify a GT student and fail to support them with appropriate instruction, they tend to really kind of go the other way and fail to engage in school in general and kind of can put all of their talents in other directions. So here are some things to look for when you're identifying a GT student. Intense interests. I'm not just interested in that, I'm interested in that. I'm passionate about that. We see that in kids a lot. Not the kid that goes from interest to interest to interest, but the kid that's like just really for months on end, just really passionate. And sometimes GT kids will switch between interests a lot, but they still go to a level of intensity that's remarkable. Kids that really learn something quickly and then get bored. Kids that have high motivation and commitment, that once they get started on something, they're going to finish it. And that can be really frustrating as a teacher. Time's up. We need to move on. And that child is not ready to let go and move on. As soon as you see that kid that is engaging and having trouble disengaging from the activity, it's a good idea to start questioning, is this a GT kid that I really need to be providing some services to? Kids with intense curiosity, they ask tons of questions. Now, you may say the things that I just listed describe every child, and to some degree they do, but when you see that intensity on those 5 factors, it's a good idea to really think about whether this individual, this child, is gifted and talented. So things we do to support them are fast pacing. and the level of challenge. And so this goes back again to differentiation, adding challenging options. So that idea that I was talking about earlier about the child who, you know, am I really looking at can they write this, or am I looking at can they provide me this reasoning? Then I have another kid right next to him who is like, done providing his reasoning and bored. Now what do I do? Well, providing some additional options. And my favorite is actually to take all those questions that they're asking me and have them go find the answers themselves. Or to just let them stay engaged and motivated and committed to that activity for a little bit longer, because I know that they'll catch up once they're ready to disengage. They'll catch up to their peers. Opportunities for self-direction are huge for GT kids. Being able to say, this is the question you were asking, find your own way to answer it, or select your own question to move on. And then strategic grouping. You know, you don't want to put all your GT kids together. That can be a disaster. You also don't want to have too big of a gap where that child who wants to move quickly is going to be really frustrated by the child who really needs to move slowly. So you want to kind of find ways to pair your GT students with other students who are going to maybe need a little bit of that excitement, but are going to be able to keep up with them, at least try to. And in science, we have a really great opportunity to support GT students because we, when we're engaged in an inquiry environment, we're already providing the opportunity for students to be a little bit self-directed on their own and to match their own interests and work together on things that they're interested in. And so really being aware of intentionally making room for that differentiation and intentionally making room for that self-direction is really important. So the forum posts for this section, for some reason the questions aren't showing up, but they are listed on the handout. And you're going to answer some questions about the 2 activities that you've done. And you're also going to provide some reflection about some specific key things that you should be doing in your classroom to support different learner types.